Happy Election Day. This is Jed Brewer with Below the Line Club and Study Groups. And it's going to be an exciting day on several levels, but I hope this next hour is exciting too. We're going to talk about software integration. Software is a huge part of our lives. It creates a lot of opportunities, but at the same time, a lot of dangers and pitfalls potentially too. So we've got two experts to help us navigate software today and hopefully avoid those pitfalls and take greater advantage of the opportunities. Our two presenters, Daylen Stoutin. Daylen is president of Clearwater Data Solutions. Just a brief bit about Daylen. He lives in the Salt Lake City, Utah area. He actually used to be a study group member, was a petroleum marketer, but ultimately left the petroleum marketing operations industry, and now with Clearwater Data Solutions is providing data solutions to petroleum marketers. And then the second individual is Johnny Bertucci. Johnny's out of the New Orleans, Louisiana area, and he's president of RowLogic. And Johnny has had a relationship with study groups for a number of years, but RowLogic, his company provides apps to the petroleum marketing space. Delivery Works, Tank Works, Price Works would be examples of some of the apps that he provides and works with a number of study group members over time. But today they're going to be talking some about why software integration matters, what executives need to know, integration methods, and even providing some examples of all of these. So I'm going to let them dive in so we can maximize their time. We would like this to be as interactive as possible, so I encourage you, if you have any questions, to type them into the dialog box that's here in this GoToWebinar framework, and I will be able to read those questions and I can relay them to either Daylen or Johnny at the appropriate time. But we do want to get your questions answered as best as possible as we move throughout. So we very much encourage questions. And this will be recorded, so we will send you the recording as well as the slide deck afterwards, and you can share it with a colleague or just have that information as a resource. So with that preamble done, I'm going to pass the controls, Daylen, over to you so you can share with us a little bit more about software integration.
All right. Well, Jed, thank you so much. Johnny and I are both extremely excited about getting to talk about this topic today. When I was a marketer, some of the things that we're going to talk about today, I really wish I had known. So it's going to be good. We're going to focus, like Jed said, on the opportunities that are really available to marketers at this point. But also focus on the dangers and how you, as an executive, the impact that you can have in avoiding those dangers. And this all really sort of starts with an assertion or an observation that in the past decade or so, software integration has really become a core competency for petroleum marketers. And I want to defend this statement here in a second, but first, I want to define what we're even talking about by software integration. Software integration is really nothing more than moving data between two systems that are not directly connected or naturally connected to one another. It might seem like it might be more than that. It's really not. But why is moving data between systems a core competency? For that, I want to look at two potential order flows through a petroleum marketer. And when I was on the marketer side, I was in operations, and this top flow was really what we did at the time, and was very common, honestly still common today. We had a tank monitoring system, and someone manned that tank monitoring system and basically decided what orders needed to be placed, and then they entered those into the ERP. Now, in principle, what's actually happening here is that they're really transposing this information, because all the information that needs to go into the ERP is already sitting in the tank monitoring system. And these little numbers up here are sort of my count of the number of touches that a clerk of some kind is going to need to do at each of these steps in order to make this happen. So in this case, it's sort of customer location, product, and quantity that gets us to this 4. And so then the order is in the ERP, and then it has to get transferred into a dispatch system, onto a delivery ticket, and then ultimately back into the ERP so that it can be billed. So this is obviously a highly manual process, and the cost is the ongoing labor. And the risk in this process is that errors are essentially unavoidable. You've got so much human interaction that there's going to be an error rate here. Now, those errors are going to be isolated incidents. Fast forward to today, and this order flow is becoming significantly more prevalent, where we have a tank monitoring system, and there's just sort of an acceptance process that kicks it into our ERP, which automatically pushes it into a dispatch system. A dispatcher assigns it to a driver, and a driver essentially just enters a quantity that was delivered, which then pushes back into an ERP for billing. So we can see that, the obvious advantages here are the automation involved, and we're going to talk about some others as we go through. The cost is the setup, but there is a risk in doing this, which is that when there are errors in that integration setup or maintenance over time, those errors are no longer isolated incidents like they are in the original top flow. They're systemic. And so it's tempting. People kind of, people know this deep in their hearts. They're like, okay, problems become systemic problems when everything is automated. And so it's tempting to take a conservative approach when it comes to integration. But what we want to do today is talk about how treating software integration as a core competency allows you to exploit the opportunities, and we're gonna walk through some of those opportunities in detail, while avoiding the dangers involved. They are very avoidable, and so the other thing that we want to do throughout today is talk about some really granular advice on how you can avoid, as an executive, what you can do to avoid those dangers. Now, before we actually get into either one of these things, Johnny is actually going to take us through some of the technical jargon that you're going to hear when it comes to software integration, and really try and demystify what software integration even really is. But I want to tee him up with a little story. I was talking to a CEO in the industry the other day, and he made this comparison that I thought was really apt. He said he thinks about software integration and sort of an executive's involvement in that process the same way that he thinks about truck configuration. If you run trucks, you actually probably know a lot about the pros and cons of configuring those trucks in different ways. So things like automatic versus manual transmissions, moving to super singles, installing cameras, should the camera be facing the driver. These are all like relatively nuanced decisions that even at the highest level, executives really make these decisions because they have long range impacts. And software integration is very similar. The impact is long range. Decisions made early on have a long range impact. And so getting a little bit into the weeds can be very valuable in sort of gaining some of that knowledge. So that's what Johnny is going to walk us through next. So Johnny, take it away.
Okie dokie. My screen should be able to be shared right now. Thanks, Daylen, so much. We good to go?
Yep.
All righty. So if we're going to dive into the meat of integration, as Daylen mentioned, we do need to understand, at least at a high level, some terms and concepts. And so I'm going to do my best to do a very brief introduction into those terms and concepts, and then dive into to an example and see what integration can look like. So what do we mean by integration? Integration is really, as Daylen mentioned, just about getting data from one system to another, just simply data flows. And there are two aspects of data flows. One is the data itself, going from one system to another system, and then the method of transfer. How do we get that data to transfer from one system to another? You've probably heard some of these words or acronyms before: FTP, API, XML, JSON, HTTPS. Basically, we computer geeks just like to throw these terms out because it helps justify our super high salaries. Everything in this word cloud falls into one of those two categories: a method of data transfer or the formatting of the data. Bottom line is that these are simply various methods and various formats. And I kind of want us to review what they look like, mainly to take the magic out of it. If we can demystify it, then I think we would be more inclined to seek integration as a way of using best-in-breed applications, increasing productivity and eliminating errors, and using robust advanced data analysis across very disparate systems. So having this knowledge will equip us to ask, penetrating questions and hold vendors and staff accountable and really be able to take integration to the next level. So very briefly, I'm going to define some terms and acronyms and then run through some real-world examples. So first, how do we transfer files? The numbers on the left side here are simply the methods when they became prevalent: import, export, FTP, API, and webhooks. Import, export, you're probably super familiar with, happens all the time. Some application has the ability to export some data, and you may alter it via Excel or some other program. And then a receiving application has the ability to import that data. Again, happens all the time. And note that this is a highly manual process. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol. Think import, export, but done by a machine rather than a human. Two applications agree on a folder somewhere on the internet to store files. One application automatically puts the file there. The receiving application gets the files that are there. So these top two, the import, export, and FTP, they've been around since the beginning. But I want to talk about the next two because really they would take file transfer to the next level. You probably heard that at least the acronym API. API stands for Application Programming Interface. As the name implies, it is a programming interface among applications. Many applications today have a variety of APIs. The way it works is that one application would write code called an API that allows any other application, and I'll stress any other application, the ability to request data or push data to the application by simply calling the API. And lastly, webhooks are very similar to APIs, actually sometimes used interchangeably. The webhooks tend to be more event-driven. When an event happens on an application, the webhook initiates a transfer of that data to a receiving application. APIs and webhooks are what make advanced real-time integration possible. And so now I want to kind of talk about the data itself and then put the two together. So fixed length, CSV, XML, and JSON. So we talked about the methods of transfer. These are the actual file formats themselves. And you'll recognize, I'm sure, CSV. Everyone has heard of CSV before, right? A common file used by Excel. If you were to double click a CSV file in Windows, more than likely it opens in Excel. But all of these file types are nothing more than text files. The only thing that's different in them is the format. And once two systems agree on the format, integration can happen. I think a picture paints 1,000 words, and so I kind of wanted to put a picture of what each file looks like. This is a pricing file example. I think most people here are familiar with DTN. DTN has similar pricing files. DTN, by the way, stands for Data Transmission Network, a company built around integration. But I wanted to point out each quadrant is displaying the exact same information. Notice that Exxon is the supplier. You have a date time, a price, same data in all four quadrants, just formatted differently. To just note the differences in the formats, fixed length uses columns, Comma-separated values uses, surprise, surprise, commas. XML uses a tagging system, and then JSON uses a pairing system. Again, I'll just kind of see what the different formats look like. But so now that we can see the data in the different formats, why would one format be more appropriate than another? As we mentioned, fixed length files have been around forever. CSV actually came along to make it easier for key punch operators when doing data entry on punch cards. But CSV and fixed length files are, unable to easily represent hierarchical data or very complex data structures. And so enter XML and JSON. Today with APIs and webhooks using XML and JSON formatted data types, complex data from very disparate systems can easily be integrated. And so like kind of understanding, how files can move back and forth and the file formats, we, in a sense, use the term we're using, exploit the opportunities of integrations. It is because of integration, and again, by integration, I mean webhooks and XML and JSON, that we can use best-in-breed applications. It is because of integration that we can see substantial, even ridiculous productivity gains. And it is because of integration that we can analyze a company's complete data picture, even with data in a variety of systems, each data set in its own silo. I want to bring us back to this slide that Daylen showed earlier as I move into a real-world example of what an effective integration could look like. So as I go through my example, I want you to be aware of how these systems would connect if being done manually. The top row here shows the possible number of touches for a manual process, but using APIs and webhooks, XML and JSON, I want to demonstrate how few touches are necessary, increasing productivity and eliminating errors. So my example is going to be as follows. Reading data from a tank monitoring program, we're going to push data into an ERP system. We're going to transfer that data to a dispatch program, deliver it, and then have the confirmation pushed back into the ERP ready for billing. Because it's a real-world example, our tank monitoring application is going to be Xfluid, written by Innova. The middleware and dispatch software is going to be from my company, RowLogic, and the ERP will be that new monopoly we call PDI. 5 steps, 4 apps, 3 vendors, all working as one seamless operation. And so here we go. We start with the tank monitoring app. Someone in the organization may be monitoring tanks using this application. When the application shows a tank that needs to have an order placed, without integration, that person would probably just enter the order into an ERP system or some other system. But using an API, in this case, the API was written by Xfluid, we can create something that allows an order to be placed automatically. So here we are looking at a middleware program written by RowLogic that uses the Xfluid API. The user simply clicks which tank he wants an order placed for, and then clicks the create orders at the bottom. I'm just going to point out a couple of things because as we trace this through, you can follow it. Note that the order is for 574 gallons, the reorder quantity. Again, I just mentioned that so that you can trace it throughout the example. So user clicks create orders. Here's the resultant screen confirming order creation. Point out a couple of things. The API in this case was written by PDI, the actual, to create the order. That API returned to us the order number. It's displayed on this confirmation screen. Just want to point out the order was created in milliseconds with no possible data entry errors. So now let's go look and see what that order looks like in PDI. So no one typed anything into any application yet. So far, we've had a checkbox on a tank screen and the click of a button to create the order. An order for 574 gallons of diesel now shows up in PDI. transfer method used was API, and the data format was XML. And PDI provides the documentation for the XML, so you know exactly how to make that call. So now, still without anyone's intervention, let's go see what happens in the dispatch application. So as the order was pushed into our ERP system, PDI, it then flowed into our dispatch system, DeliveryWorks, automatically using an API we wrote and data format of XML. No errors, no typos, real time, instantly. Here is the first time the order needs to be touched, and that is for a dispatcher to put it onto a truck. So in this application, the dispatcher would simply drag the order and put it onto a truck. Here is the order sitting on the truck as it appears to the dispatcher. What remains now is for the driver to actually deliver the product and have that delivery confirmation flow back into the ERP for billing. So this is what the driver would see. This is the image, what would be shown on an iPad or an Android tablet. The order would just be displayed there for him to note the gallons delivered and get the customer's signature. So note here that the driver entered 550 gallons. Again, that's just to confirm and check back into our ERP system. 2 more touches, if you will. And then using a webhook shown here on the setup page of the DeliveryWorks app, as soon as the driver presses the submit button on his iPad, this completed order will flow back into the ERP, again, in this case, PDI, using the webhook that is configured on the DeliveryWorks application. And here it is. Real time, note the updated quantity of 550 gallons, the ordered quantity of 574 gallons, and the status of dispatch. Using our earlier data model, I want to review the flow. The only time in this real-world example that integration needed someone to do something was when a human decision needed to be made, which tanks we wanted to place an order for, and which truck we wanted to deliver the order. Other than that, everything was electronic via APIs and webhooks. Using XML and JSON, we used the best-of-breed applications, whether it be tank monitoring, logistics, or ERP, and realized the game-changing productivity. And wanted to reiterate the real-time capability of these integrations, where data is being transferred in real time to be able to go back and forth between these systems. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Daylen, and he's going to complete the integration example and then take us the rest of the way. So Jed, feel free to pull me out and give it back to Daylen.
Yeah, one quick question for you, Johnny, while Daylen's pulling up his stuff. What is the optimal number of touches that you should have? I think you gave an example where there was 3. Should we be able to even drive that a little bit lower, or do you want some touches in
there? Believe it or not, I think with even more integration, you can drive those touches down. The example I showed was a real world example. So, but let's say you connected your iPad to a meter on your truck. Well, then the driver doesn't even need to type in the gallons delivered. He can, the iPad can pull it directly from the truck. If the tank, we clicked a button and said, hey, place this order for 574 gallons, the person that's, monitoring that may want to say, well, no, I want to really go 600 gallons because the order is not going to get out there till 2 days from now, and I know they're going to be, using gallons while in those 2 days. So I think again, it's like whenever a human makes sense or needs to be able to make a determination, you're going to have a touch of some sort. But certainly the technology exists to take out lots of touches.
Thanks, Johnny. Daylen, go ahead.
All right, you can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So what I'm gonna do next is show just one more of these opportunities that you have with integrations before we move on to the dangers. And this one really starts with recognizing that within each of these applications, as things become more and more digitized over time, you're actually collecting massive amounts of really granular, really valuable data. And you want to be able to use that data to improve your operations over time. One challenge that you'll run into is that each of these systems have their own database, which means that the data is siloed. And frequently the most interesting questions, because these apps are working together, some of the most interesting and valuable questions that we can answer with data is going to require data from multiple sources in order to really accomplish the goal that we have. And the interesting thing is that integrations is actually the solution to this problem as well. So what we're going to show is how you can use a business intelligence software to serve as a centralized reporting depot for all of these distinct databases, creating a sort of like a single source of truth for your organization, and a single place to go look at data, and it really creates opportunities that we didn't have any other way. Now, the key feature, business intelligence software, is just a dynamic visual reporting tool. If you're familiar with Power BI or Tableau or Sisense or Looker, these are BI tools, business intelligence tools. But one of the features that they all have in common is that they are source agnostic, meaning they don't care where the data is coming from. So the example that we're going to use to demonstrate this, I'm not going to show the plumbing. This is using very similar methods to what Johnny showed us, but just to demonstrate why this is really valuable. This is a tool that we built that just compares driver pay to the freight revenue generated by those drivers. And this is a ratio actually that Study Groups runs. You can run this ratio straight off your financial statements. In this case, for this client, it's 34%. And they've set a target of 33%. So they're trying to drive that down. But if you run this number at the highest level, you're left with a question of where you need to go focus in order to really impact this number. And with integrations, we can actually solve that problem because we can run this same ratio, driver pay as a percentage of freight revenue, down to the individual day for the individual driver. And by doing that, we can triangulate where our problems are. So let me show you how that works a little bit. This is just we've connected everything in the background where we have our freight revenue coming from our ERP system, and driver pay is a combination of some hourly data from our ELD system and a payroll system. And so once we connect all those things together on a transaction by transaction basis, we can run this same ratio for every driver. So now we know that Socrates is our worst driver, ranging down to Mozart being our best driver. And we can isolate one of these guys, Julius Caesar, and then scroll down and identify whether it's a systemic problem, meaning every single day he's at something like 43%. In this case, that's not the case. About 20% of his days, each of these dots represents a day, about 20% of these days are problematic. The rest of these are just fine. So what we can do is we can then isolate an individual day. We would probably sort of toggle through multiple of these. And then now we have something very actionable. We can say Julius Caesar on July 3rd worked 8 hours, almost 9 hours. We paid him $200. He only produced $327 worth of freight revenue. And again, hours from the ELD system, pay from the payroll system, freight revenue from the ERP. But what we can do with this is we can now go find out exactly what happened on that day. And if there's a systemic problem to be fixed, we can fix it and eliminate this from happening in the future. And this is one example. There are dozens or even hundreds of very similar types of analyses where we take a leading or lagging metric at the highest level in the organization and then build it down to where we can go super deep into the data. And the only way that that's possible is through these types of integrations that we've been talking about. We've looked at 3 opportunities related to integrations, getting really comfortable with integrations, maybe taking kind of an aggressive stance. We can, again, sort of build, I think of the best in breed thing as being building your own ecosystem of tools and apps and being able to buy the piece of software that is really the best for that area of the business operationally, knowing we can get these things to talk to each other, even if they're not produced by the same vendor. Building out game-changing productivity, that has a lot to do with automation, and then doing advanced cross-system data analysis. But what Johnny and I don't want to imply is that integrations are always successful. It is very possible to go all the way through setting up an integration just to have it fail at one of the links in the chain. Before we dive, we're going to dive into how you can, as an executive, really avoid a lot of the dangers involved in integrations and be confident that you can execute on these opportunities. Before we do that, I want to let Johnny talk through a few of the scenarios, detailed specific stories that have happened to give you an idea of how this really can go wrong if we're not careful. So Johnny, go ahead.
Yeah, these are actual things that happened. So happened to me while we were doing some integrations. The first one, we actually gave a name to each of the types. The first type of scenario we called it the vendor problem. So this is a real world example of an integration disaster. So I was integrating an ERP with a dispatch software, and our common client was convinced by the ERP vendor to allow them to write the webhook, to write the API webhook for the ERP, such that when an order was ready for dispatch, it would be pushed directly to the dispatch system. So the client agreed, the ERP vendor wrote the webhook. It took lots of months and lots of dollars to write this, and it worked well for a number of years, but the dispatch software was enhanced, and the client wanted to use these new features, which required an upgrade to the ERP vendor's webhook. So, went out to the ERP vendor, got a quote to do so again, but it was, again, lots of months and lots of dollars. So much so that the client wound up scrapping the vendor's webhook and wound up using the webhook from the dispatch software, which was, much less money and much faster to be developed. A real world example, these ERP vendors really do have a quoting, where the dollars are a lot and the time frame is usually substantial as well. The second real world example I have, we call it an API gap. Again, this is a problem where the vendor has a set of APIs, maybe even a robust set of APIs, but missing the one you need for your particular integration. We were working on an integration. Again, the vendor had a boatload of APIs, but we were missing something as simple as a customer list API. We had no way to get that list of APIs, had to write our own little workaround to do that. Again, you would have thought that the vendor would have had a customer list API. And our last example, we call it the half complete. This is where an API is working properly from a technical standpoint, data's going back and forth, but the issue is with the data itself. So we have an integration where data from a third-party dispatch system in certain situations wasn't passing the record over to the ERP system. And that's actually worse than not working at all. So anyway, just 3 problems we've run into doing these integrations. I'm going to pass it back to Daylen because he's going to tell us how to avoid them.
All right. So for the rest of our time, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 areas that executives can have a really significant impact in avoiding these dangers. The dangers actually, they vary from project to project. And so what we want to give you is a way of thinking about projects that are going to help you identify what the problems are going to be as early on in the process as possible. So we're going to look at a project evaluation process framework for that. We're going to talk about who it makes sense to actually have wire up these integrations, and then we're going to talk about how you as the executive can hold everyone, vendors and employees, accountable throughout the process. So first, we're going to take a look at project evaluation, and this is going to be this is kind of the way that we think about projects. And by thinking about projects this way, it really makes some of the dangers significantly more obvious. And here's how it works. You think about every project that you could do across two dimensions. The first one is novelty, ranging from, this vendor or whoever's going to be doing the integration. We do this all the time. It's very routine for us, done it a lot, all the way up to, as far as we know, no one's ever integrated these two systems together. And then on the other axis, we have reward, ranging from, it would be helpful to have these two systems talking to each other, all the way up to, okay, this gives us capacities and capabilities as a business that we never had before. And so we can plot different types of projects into this grid. As an example, moving pricing data, for instance, from BTN into an ERP, might be in the bottom left corner down here. It's been done forever. It's definitely helpful. DeliveryWorks, implementing DeliveryWorks and stitching it in with your back office system can be very, very transformative, particularly if they're coming off of some sort of paper solution. But Johnny and his team have implemented DeliveryWorks with pretty much every back office system at this point. So somewhere in the routine range. A custom business intelligence tool that you sort of sync up and then have built would be up here in this upper right. A more standardized business intelligence tool might be in the middle. And then we've got a concept of implementing like a chat bot in your organization somewhere to help with operational efficiencies or something. Very unique, maybe mildly helpful. So now that we have this, certain things become obvious. One of them is a prioritization framework. So we can think about where it makes sense to focus our energies first, because you can actually, like, the number of things that you could integrate are almost endless, but your time and your resources are not. So we're suggesting you focus in this bottom right corner first. These are things that are going to be transformative for your business, but that people have done before. And so, or the vendor that we are working with has done before. So the likelihood of success is pretty high. Next, you move straight up. I'm going to stay in this transformative realm, but we move straight up and we say, okay, what can we do that we can really set up as a strategic advantage for our business? Note that, in this bottom area, you're really in defense mode. You're doing things other people have done in the past. By moving straight vertical, you're moving into offense. Third, we're going to go into this bottom left quadrant. These are sometimes this is blocking and tackling stuff that you have to do early on. But we're having this be 3, and then lastly, up here in this upper left corner, likely we never quite get to these projects, which is entirely okay. So we're going to come back to this in just a second. So keep this in your mind. But first, we're going to talk about who it actually makes sense to delegate the integration process to, like the actual stitching things together. And there are basically three possible approaches. And this is where we see a lot of the dangers, like in hindsight, this is where we see a lot of improvement potential, is in sort of assigning the right projects to the right groups of people. So 3 options. One is you can develop the internal expertise to do this. The advantage to doing that, obviously, is that it opens up your choices of softwares you could buy to pretty much anything, because you know that you can get them to talk to each other with internal talent. Now, the downside, obviously, is you do have to have this person or these people on staff. So another option that can be really good in certain circumstances is pretty much every ERP vendor at this point doesn't just have their primary back office software that they sell. They have an array of ancillary solutions as well that they sell and plug into that ERP. So the advantage here is that they steer. If you buy one of their ancillary tools, they're going to make that work with their ERP. Now, the downside can be really, really significant, however. One, it limits your choices down to pretty much the one tool that they have for that facet of your business. And you're really at their mercy over time in terms of enhancements, in terms of time frame, et cetera. It's got a lot of eggs in one basket. So the third option is what we're calling the niche vendor. And this is where Johnny and I would fall. We have very specific tools that we focus on a lot. And one of the things that we really pride on ourselves on is the ability to get our tools to work with other tools without having to have the client have to actually stitch those things together, have to have that knowledge. So you get more choices, you can look at more options, but you can control your costs. And then, but you do have more cooks in the kitchen to coordinate, which is the downside on this one. So the most successful approach that we've seen is people not taking one of these as their company-wide approach, but fitting the implementer to the project. So we can actually go look at this, and this is going to be like a little bit of a heuristic of which implementers make sense in which quadrants here. So for example, if you have the internal expertise on your staff, you can pretty much do any of these and be pretty confident you can execute. ERP vendors are very good at stitching together, or they should be very, very good at stitching together the systems that they own, multiple systems that they own. Where they start to run into trouble, as we've seen it, is the further you move north in this graph. It's just not their primary wheelhouse to do custom work, essentially. And that's where sort of niche vendors fit. You do have to evaluate them, but it can be a very good strategy, even with very unique implementations and integrations, to use a niche vendor for this upper right quadrant. We do suggest keeping them in this transformative realm just because it is another relationship to manage, et cetera. And then in this upper left, I know before we had it as a 4, but we're suggesting you just basically avoid this quadrant. There are some inherent risks in doing things that are totally unique, and if it's just helpful, it's probably better to allocate your resources elsewhere. So we've talked about two ways that executives can be really involved in the process to avoid these dangers: thinking through projects really strategically, and thinking through who those projects are assigned to really strategically. Both of those kind of happen on the front end, but over time, you also want to hold everybody accountable. And the way to do that is by asking really penetrating, deep questions that get people thinking. And what our hope is that in the last 30 minutes or so, we've given you some of the tools that these questions that we're going to go through will seem relatively natural, and that more will come to your mind. But you can pocket these ones because these ones are really good. The way this is going to work is that our theme is going to be ask a question, but also ask sort of the next level question. And these implementer types are going to kind of fade in and out based on whether it's applicable to the question. So for instance, ask if you're working with a vendor, have you integrated these two systems before? But also ask, did the integration do everything that we're trying to do? It's a much higher bar. The second question is a much higher bar. You can actually integrate the same two systems in a bunch of different ways. So it's worth really pressing them on this. Ask, is there an API? But also ask, what does the API actually do? Similar to the last question, APIs are not a blank check into some piece of software. So you want to make sure that, okay, here's our list of objectives here. Will this API do all of that? If you're working with a niche vendor, go ahead and ask them if they'll help you integrate with X, with your ERP vendor or whatever it is. But also just ask if they'll go ahead and coordinate directly with them. Lots of niche vendors will do that. They'll just make it work for you. Johnny recently was working with a client who wanted to integrate DeliveryWorks with an ERP that Johnny's never done before. And the client very wisely was really pressing both sides to make sure that this was going to work. And so Johnny actually flew up the ERP's headquarters and had a day-long meeting to make sure that this was going to work. Ask how does support for this integration work? This is if you're doing it with internal talent. But also make sure that your people are asking, when I need support, can I talk to an engineer and not just to a support person? What we're finding is that a lot of these software vendors, they're writing advanced webhooks and APIs, but user support people don't really know how they work. And so you need to be able to get to engineering when you need them. Ask, what is this going to cost to set up? But also think through, what is this going to cost to maintain over time? Both the hard costs, there's also usually like a kind of an ongoing maintenance cost associated with just your employees keeping the two systems kind of humming. And then finally, ask, what can I gain by implementing an integration between these two systems? But also ask, how am I going to avoid the dangers? And really press on that. And that's what we've been talking about. You know, the idea that software integration is really a core competency because you want to exploit these opportunities, but you do want to avoid the dangers as well. So hopefully we've given you a framework for that second half and have demonstrated that the opportunities are huge. So with that, Jed, I think we're ready for questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, please do take time and type in a question or two if you have one. Daylen, I will say I really enjoy those questions, but also ask those questions. That's really good information in there. One question that a member asked said, going back to trying to get information, and the question said, how do you try and get information when a particular service does not offer an automated way of getting it? So either they're not cooperating or won't cooperate, or you don't know who they are. Web scraping is an example of pulling information off a website. But how do you get information when there's not an automated way to do it?
Interesting. I mean, I have a couple thoughts. Yeah.
Okay,
John,
go ahead, Daylen. I'll say a couple of things, and then Daylen, you can go.
Go.
But what we do a lot of times is, as long as most vendors will give us ODBC access to their database, like a read-only access. And so what that does is that allows us to, as long as we can figure out, or they'll help us figure out we call it an ERD, the entity relationship diagram, and understand the underlying data. And typically we can provide the integration necessary. And most times we're able to manage that process.
And Daylen, were you going to chime in too?
Yeah, So I think maybe what this question is aimed at, the web scraping makes me think that maybe what it's aimed at is not just like we have a vendor that we can't quite figure out how to get the data out, but it's more like this public data somewhere that we're trying to scrape. And to be totally blunt, that is a different skill set, and I definitely would find there are phenomenal vendors out there that can do that on an automated basis, sort of go out the things that people are doing with artificial intelligence at this point is really incredible. But Johnny is right. If what we're really talking about is moving data between systems that are our systems, then I would just press the vendor basically. If they're not giving us what we need to get data between systems, that's becoming so normal that it would be concerning to me to have a vendor that really just won't give you access to their data in any way, your data really.
Thanks, Daylen. And here was a statement from a member rather than a question, but you were talking about you can use your ERP person, you can use internal talent, you can use a niche vendor, and this person just said, remember that developing stuff using internal expertise leaves you exposed to a single point of failure with little to no backup. So I do think that's a interesting comment to continue to keep in mind.
Yeah, and Jed, that actually, I'd like to respond to that because that's a really good point. One thing that we didn't say throughout this presentation that I think is worth noting is that the internal expertise thing is really, it's a spectrum. And it can be really valuable to, we've given some things today that are just, honestly, like here's the beginning of that internal expertise. But even if you're going to use niche vendors or ERP, having somebody on staff that, even if they're going to do the work, that can really press them and ask them the right questions is monumentally valuable. And then it's less of a failure point too. If you have that person and all they're really doing is keeping those vendors honest.
Another question, how important is it to have a clean data set before considering integration between two systems?
Oh man, I love this question. Johnny, you can jump in after me, but I love this question. Johnny and I talk about this all the time.
It depends on how clean.
It does depend on how clean, but one thing that I really like to say is that no data is no data, but clean data. If you have an agile person that is doing your integration and a really creative problem solver, we've found that we can we use the word hack, which sounds like a bad thing, but creatively back into a solution that lots of times, like, our clients think my data is too dirty, my data just isn't even close to clean enough, and we get in there and we're like, okay, no, we can scrub this, we can make this work, change this one procedure and everything will flow. So I would just say that it has a lot to do with the person implementing and how flexible they are with building out those integrations. Johnny, do you want to add anything to that?
Just that you can also, like, if you have disparate systems and the data is in a sense wonky in each, lots of all the applications from like ERPs and our applications, DeliveryWorks, and even SciSense, what Daylen's using, have natively like built-in translation tables and built-in ways of just being able to connect the data, even if it's dirty. And we fight through that, but once it's done, you're looking good. And then you even can create opportunities to, clean the data. So like you've got an easy way to clean the data. So yeah, no, that what Daylen was saying was right on.
Another question, guys. This relates with PDI a little bit, but software conversion integration is very expensive and time consuming. And given that PDI is taking over the software universe, is it still viable to spend money on other software rather than migrating to PDI if an upgrade is in the future?
Johnny, I kind of absorbed that last one. Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things we didn't mention in the presentation we thought about was even like the PDI world and all the software that they're acquiring, they need to integrate it. It's like they're not getting out of integrating things, but they're the ERP doing the integration. You think they can have a little bit more, whatever resources to throw at it, et cetera. But that's not necessarily best in breed. And, there's reasons to, if you will, drink the PDI Kool-Aid and stay in that world. Lots of good reasons to, but there's, I think, an equally valid reason to, figure out, what is going to bring, your, petroleum marketer to the next level. And is it the various tools that are provided by PDI, not integration, these conversions are right. I mean, it's like they are expensive, they're time consuming, they're resource intensive. That's why when you select an ERP vendor, you don't switch off of them easily, no matter, how they're doing, you tend to stick with them because changing is so difficult and painful. But even, switching, ERP systems and whatnot, you can get a team, if a team is competent, especially like we're talking about integration, but the conversion uses a lot of the same if you will, skill set that integration, uses, trying to get data from one system into another system, right? I'm taking data from my old system, putting it into a new system, and, use the tools that are available, import, export, FTP, the APIs and webhooks, and try to get all of that stuff squared away. It's possible and very doable.
I would just add that it's worthwhile to make a distinction between the ERP vendor's core ERP, talking about PDI. PDI, I think if the question is, the fear is I'm going to switch off of PDI onto some new ERP system, like my actual back office onto a new one, and then PDI is just going to buy that one. And so now I'm right back where I started. I think there's a that I think is somewhat of a, that's a different thing than all of the ancillary systems that are out there, right? You have to have a dispatch software. And again, like Johnny said, there's no inherent connection between, for instance, PDI's primary flagship ERP and their dispatch system. They still have to integrate those. And so you can absolutely do that with outside, for your ancillary stuff, outside vendors, without losing a whole lot of efficiency. And I think you gain a lot by not having so many eggs in one basket.
Yeah, thank you. And one other sort of comment here, but it says, my experience is that many vendors are reluctant to give their customers access to their data. I believe in most cases it's because the vendors didn't design their databases with sharing that data in mind. I'm curious what thoughts or comments you have on that.
Johnny, I'm going to say just one thing, and then I would like to hear what you think on this. Basically, I just think that the market is in transition. So more and more, this is becoming a requirement of customers. And software vendors that are resisting it are going to have, they're going to be, over time, they're going to be the laggards, and they're going to either catch on or go away, is my belief. And so I would I would press them on it. And if they won't do it, consider switching, because the value is immense. Johnny, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. Certainly years ago, that was, the data and the way it was, structured in these systems was considered proprietary. And some vendors still consider their data proprietary. But because of what Daylen's saying is nowadays, vendors are like, having to make their data available if they want to stay viable. And even, the vendors that we've been working with, a lot of them are starting to provide the data dictionaries, so, and the definitions. And so people who are doing integrations, don't even have to, sort of work with an engineer at the ERP firm, because look, here's the documentation, here's the way the data is structured, here's our ERD diagrams, here's our data dictionaries, and you can, go to town with them. And like Daylen said, if they're not doing that, they're not going to be around long, because, this whole, keeping your data in your silo where nobody else can access it. There are some vendors who are still like that, and, people are not going to be selecting them because there's no way to integrate them.
Well, one last question, guys, and then we'll wrap up. But business intelligence that you touched on, what sort of things are petroleum distributors using business intelligence for? You gave the driver example, which this person said is great, but what are some of the other things being focused on? And also, is this function best done internally or working with an outside person or partner?
Yeah. So we're doing sort of lots of different things with BI, and they fall into multiple categories. One is I'm going to pick a domain of my business that I just want to understand better, and I want my people to have better data on. So all of my sales data, for instance, I want to be able to move quickly, laterally, and deep through that data to answer my questions where I'm kind of coming at it with an idea of the answers, the questions I have. And then another thing that people are using business intelligence for is really almost building algorithms where we embed some business logic into it. And we give that tool then to a human being and say, this is exactly what I want you to do with this. Now we have almost no time left. So in terms of who it makes sense to have do this, I do think those are the two options. You can outsource it, or you can do it internally. Obviously, my business is built on taking that burden off of you. So that's the way that I think it makes sense to go. But you can absolutely do it internally. You just have to be willing to put in the time and the effort to learn and get really good at it.
Well, sounds great. Daylen, Johnny, I appreciate all the information shared today, the great questions. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but if you want to follow up with either Johnny or Daylen individually, I know they would be very happy to speak with you more, whether about this webinar or even some of the products and services that they respectively provide. I hope you found this time educational, and again, wish you all a very happy election day. Goodbye.